The silk of the wedding gown, a monstrous ivory cage, felt like 1,000 biting ants against Elara Vance's skin, each thread a stitch in the tapestry of her despair. It was the eve of her union with Bartholomew Thorne, a man whose touch was colder than the January wind that rattled the panes of her father's grand, lonely house, a house built on ambition and mortgaged with her future. The air in her chamber, heavy with the scent of forced hothouse roses and beeswax polish, choked her, a perfumed poison designed to lull her into acceptance. She stood before the cheval glass, a ghost in white, her reflection a stranger with haunted eyes, eyes that held the vast gray emptiness of the plains she yearned for but could not reach. Bartholomew Thorne. The name itself was a clang of iron, a shutting door. He was a man of considerable wealth and influence, a man her father, Alistair Vance, saw as a cornerstone for the family's ascent, a bulwark against the whispers of their dwindling fortune. Her mother, Eleanor, fluttered with an agitated pride, her words painting Thorne as a providential catch, a man of stature, conveniently ignoring the chill in his gaze, the possessive curve of his lip when he looked at Elara as if she were another acquisition, a prized mare to be stabled and shown. Elara saw only the predator beneath the veneer of tailored broadcloth, the subtle cruelty that flickered in his pale eyes when he thought no one was watching, the way his fingers had once lingered on her arm, a brand of ownership she had recoiled from with a violence that had surprised even herself. That small act of defiance had earned her a steely glare from her father and a week of her mother's tearful admonishments about a daughter's duty. Duty. The word was a stone in her belly. Her duty was to be a pretty sacrifice on the altar of their societal aspirations. The gown, with its intricate lace sourced from some far-off fashionable city, its whalebone stays that cinched her breath away, was a physical manifestation of their expectations, beautiful and suffocating. She pressed her hands to the cold glass of the window, looking out at the stark, moon-bleached landscape of the sprawling ranch that bordered their more modest but still significant holdings. Thorne's ranch, soon to be her prison. The wind howled a mournful song, a dirge for her stolen girlhood, for the dreams of a life lived under an open sky, free and untethered, dreams she had nurtured in the secret, wilder corners of her heart. Inner strength, her grandmother used to say, was a wellspring, but Elara felt hers had run dry, leaving only a parched and aching void. Pride, yes, she had that, a stubborn refusal to weep before them, to let them see the true depth of her desolation. And endurance, she was learning that, minute by agonizing minute. But tonight, the isolation was a crushing weight. The vastness outside mocked the confinement within. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift from her late grandfather, lay on her dressing table, its smooth, worn surface a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. He had understood her spirit, had told her tales of wild lands and courageous hearts. She picked it up, its familiar shape, a small comfort, in her palm. He would never have countenanced this. He would have told her to fly. But how? Where? The house was a fortress of propriety, every door and window a testament to their commitment to this disastrous alliance. She thought of the stables, the scent of hay and horseflesh, the only place she ever felt a semblance of freedom, grooming her mare, Starlight, her one true confidant. Tomorrow, Starlight would be part of her dowry, another possession passed to Thorne. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. The moon, a cold silver disk in the inky sky, seemed to watch her with pitiless indifference. Was there no escape? Was this to be her fate, a slow withering in a gilded cage, her spirit gradually extinguished by the cold indifference of a man she loathed and the crushing expectations of a family she no longer recognized? The silence of the house was profound, yet it screamed at her, a silent chorus of her impending doom. She traced the pattern of frost on the window pane, a delicate, ephemeral art that would be gone by morning, much like her hope, if she did not find a way. A desperate, fragile tendril of defiance began to uncoil within her, small and trembling, yet fiercely alive. She would not go to him like a lamb. She would not. The how remained a terrifying unknown, a chasm she had to cross. But the why blazed with sudden, startling clarity. Her life was her own. It was not a commodity to be bartered. and if she had to tear the world apart to reclaim it, then so be it. The night was deep, the house asleep, but Elara Vance was more awake than she had ever been. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hall chimed 3. Each stroke a hammer blow against the fragile silence Elara had wrapped around herself like a stolen cloak. Her heart thrummed a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for release. The ivory monstrosity of the wedding gown lay heaped on the floor, a shed skin of a life she refused to live, discarded with a revulsion that was almost physical. In its place, she wore her sturdiest riding skirt, a dark wool that would not betray her in the shadows, and a boy's flannel shirt, pilfered from a forgotten chest in the attic, its worn softness a comfort. Her boots, scuffed and familiar, felt like allies on her feet. The small wooden bird her grandfather had carved was tucked safely into a pocket, its presence a talisman against the fear that gnawed at the edges of her resolve. Every creak of the old house was a shouted warning, every sigh of the wind a pursuer's breath. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, a desperate, frantic choreography of escape. The back stairs, narrow and seldom used, were her chosen path, leading down to the scullery and then, with luck, to the unbolted side door that opened onto the kitchen garden. Luck. She would need more than luck. She would need a miracle. Her father, Alistair, was a light sleeper, his ears attuned to any irregularity, and Bartholomew Thorne's men, she'd heard whispered, were already quartered in the bunkhouse. A subtle show of force, a reminder of his reach. The thought of them, faceless and menacing, spurred her onward. She carried nothing but a small satchel containing a little hoarded money, a hunk of bread and cheese, and a water skin. To take more would be to invite suspicion if she were caught, to encumber her flight. Starlight, her beautiful, gentle mare. The pain of leaving her behind was a fresh, sharp agony, but to try and take her would be folly. The sound of hooves in the night, a certain alarm. She had whispered her goodbyes to the mare earlier, pressing her face into Starlight's warm neck, her tears matting the soft fur, a silent promise that this was not a final parting, though in her heart she feared it might be. The stairs groaned under her weight, each step an eternity. She froze, listening, her breath held tight in her chest. Only the rhythmic tick-tock of the distant clock answered. The scullery was cold, smelling of damp stone and yesterday's onions. The bolt on the side door was stiff, resisting her trembling fingers, a final stubborn guardian of her prison. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it would not yield, that she would be trapped by a simple piece of iron. Then, with a grating shriek that seemed to echo through the silent house, it slid back. She slipped outside, the frigid night air a shock against her heated skin, a brutal, exhilarating slap of freedom. The moon, her earlier tormentor, was now her guide, casting long, dancing shadows that offered her cover as she skirted the edge of the manicured lawns, heading towards the wilder, untamed land that lay beyond her father's fences. The vast, dark expanse of the plain stretched before her, an ocean of whispering grass and unknown perils. For the first time, the sheer scale of her undertaking struck her with its full force. She was one small, fleeing figure against an immense and indifferent wilderness. Where would she go? Who would help her? The questions were a cold dread in her stomach, but the alternative, the cold embrace of Bartholomew Thorne, the slow death of her spirit, was a far greater terror. She ran, heedless of the rough ground that tore at her skirt and stumbled her steps, driven by a primal instinct for survival. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A summer day years ago, her grandfather lifting her onto his own sturdy gelding, his laughter booming as they galloped across an open meadow, the wind whipping through her hair. "The world is wide, Elara," he'd said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Never let anyone make it small for you." His words, a distant echo, became her mantra. The world is wide. The world is wide. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until the grand house of her captivity was just a distant, malevolent glimmer against the dark horizon. Then and only then did she allow herself a single shuddering sob, not of despair but of a terrifying, nascent hope. She was free, but she was also utterly alone, a fugitive under a canopy of cold, uncaring stars, with the wolves of her past surely not far behind. The wind rose, carrying the scent of dust and distance, and Elara Vance, no longer a bride-to-be but a desperate creature of the night, pressed onward into the beckoning, formidable darkness. The false dawn was a smear of bruised purple and reluctant gray on the eastern horizon when Elara finally stumbled, her body a symphony of aches, her spirit frayed to a single, tenacious thread. The initial exhilaration of escape had long since ebbed, replaced by a gnawing exhaustion and the relentless thrum of fear. She had pushed herself too hard, driven by the imagined sounds of pursuit, the thunder of hooves that existed only in her panicked mind, or so she prayed. The landscape had become harsher, the rolling grasslands giving way to broken, rocky terrain, punctuated by skeletal trees and thorny scrub. She was lost, disoriented, the water skin nearly empty, the bread a dry memory in her mouth. A sudden sharp pain shot through her ankle as she misstepped on a loose rock, sending her sprawling to the unforgiving ground. A cry of frustration and pain escaped her lips, swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence. Tears welled, hot and stinging, blurring the desolate scene. This was foolish, impossible. She was a girl who knew how to manage a household, embroider a sampler, play the pianoforte passably well, not a creature of the wilderness. Yet, here she was, her fine clothes torn, her hands scraped raw, her carefully constructed composure shattered. As she struggled to sit up, wincing at the throbbing in her ankle, the sky began to weep. Fat, cold drops of rain splattered against the dust, quickly coalescing into a determined downpour. The temperature plummeted, and the wind, which had been a mournful whisper, rose to a keening howl, driving the rain into her face with stinging force. She was exposed, vulnerable, and now a storm was brewing, a vast, dark leviathan of cloud and fury rolling in from the west, mirroring the tempest in her soul. Despair, cold and insidious, began to seep into her bones, more chilling than the rain. Just as she was about to surrender to it, to curl up against a rock and let the elements claim her, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of light pricked the gloom. Smoke? Or was it a trick of her tired eyes? Hope, that stubborn, resilient weed, pushed through the cracks of her despair. With a monumental effort, she hauled herself to her feet, using a fallen branch as a crude crutch, and limped towards the distant, uncertain promise of shelter. The journey was an agony. Each step sent jolts of pain through her injured ankle, and the rain plastered her hair to her scalp, blinding her. But the light, a small, steady beacon in the growing storm, drew her onward. It was a cabin, a rough-hewn structure of logs chinked with mud, nestled against a rocky outcrop, looking as though it had grown from the very earth itself. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a pale gray tendril against the bruised and turbulent sky, a sign of life, of warmth, relief, so potent it was almost painful, washed over her. She half stumbled, half fell towards the door, her knuckles rapping weakly against the solid wood. For a long moment there was no answer, only the roar of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain. She was about to knock again, her strength failing, when the door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of warm, firelit interior and the dark silhouette of a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face lost in the shadows, but the wariness in his stance was palpable. "What do you want?" His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together, devoid of welcome. Elara swayed, clutching the doorframe for support, words caught in her throat. She was a sight. She knew drenched, muddied, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Please," she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Shelter. The storm." He said nothing, his silence an unnerving appraisal. She could feel his gaze, sharp and penetrating, even in the dim light. She imagined he saw a runaway, a troublemaker, a burden. Perhaps he would turn her away, send her back into the tempest. The thought was unbearable. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, He pulled the door open wider. "Get in," he growled, not unkindly, but with a weariness that spoke of a man long accustomed to solitude and, perhaps, to trouble finding his doorstep. "Don't stand there dripping on the threshold." Elara practically fell inside, the sudden warmth of the small cabin wrapping around her like a benediction. A fire blazed in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. It was a Spartan space, but clean, orderly. There was a single bunk, a table, 2 chairs, shelves holding a few essentials. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, something wild and faintly masculine. The man watched her, his expression unreadable. He was as rugged as the land outside, his face weathered, lines etched around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes, she could see now, were a startling gray, like a winter sky, and they missed nothing. He was not handsome in the conventional drawing room sense like Bartholomew, but there was a raw, untamed power about him that was both intimidating and strangely compelling. "Storm came up fast," he commented, more to himself than to her, as he closed the door, shutting out the fury of the elements. Elara leaned against the rough wall, shivering, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. She had escaped one cage, only to find herself at the mercy of a stranger, a solitary cowboy in a remote cabin, with a storm raging outside and the wolves of her past still a threat she could not ignore. The silence in the small cabin was thick, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the relentless howl of the wind as it battered the sturdy log walls. Elara huddled near the hearth, the borrowed blanket the man had silently offered her, wrapped tightly around her shoulders, yet she still shivered, as much from nerves as from cold. Her rescuer, for that is what he was, despite his gruff demeanor, moved with a quiet, almost unnerving competence. He stoked the fire, added another log, then went about his routine as if her sudden, dramatic appearance was a minor inconvenience rather than a startling interruption to his solitude. His name, she would later learn, was Silas Blackwood, a name that seemed to suit his dark, brooding presence and the somber depths in his gray eyes. He had said little since ushering her inside, his initial terse instruction to get dry being the extent of his conversation. Elara, acutely aware of her disheveled state and the precariousness of her situation, found her own voice trapped by a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He had taken her wet cloak and hung it near the fire, his movements economical, almost deliberate, as if he measured every action. Now he was brewing coffee, the aroma rich and inviting, a small comfort in the charged atmosphere. He poured a tin cup for himself, and after a moment's hesitation that Elara did not miss, poured another and gestured towards the table. "Drink," he said. It wasn't a request. She moved to the small, rough-hewn table, her injured ankle protesting with a dull throb. He noticed her slight limp, his gaze flicking down to her foot and then back to her face, but he made no comment. The coffee was strong, black, and scalding hot, but it sent a welcome warmth through her chilled body. She cupped the tin mug in her trembling hands, her eyes downcast, studying the whorls in the wooden tabletop. What must he think of her? A young woman, alone, appearing out of a storm in the middle of nowhere, clearly running from something or someone. He sat opposite her, nursing his own coffee, his silence a heavy blanket. Elara felt an overwhelming urge to explain, to justify her presence, but the words wouldn't come. How much could she reveal? How much dare she trust this stranger whose eyes seemed to see right through her carefully constructed defenses? "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am," Silas finally stated, his voice still low and gravelly, but perhaps a fraction less harsh, "and not dressed for this kind of weather or this kind of country." His observation hung in the air. It was an invitation, a gentle prod for information. Elara swallowed. I got lost," she offered, the lie weak even to her own ears. His lips thinned almost imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement of her untruth, but he didn't press. Instead, he rose and rummaged in a small wooden chest, producing a clean strip of linen and a jar of some dark, pungent salve. He gestured towards her ankle. "Let me see." She hesitated. The thought of his hands on her, even for a moment of care, was unsettling. Bartholomew's touch had been a violation. This man's, she, didn't know what to expect. But the throbbing in her ankle was undeniable, and his expression, though still stoic, held a hint of something that wasn't unkindness. Reluctantly, she lifted the hem of her skirt and extended her foot. He knelt before her, his movements surprisingly gentle as he examined the swollen, discolored joint. His fingers were calloused, strong, yet his touch was unexpectedly careful as he cleaned the scrapes and applied the soothing salve. Elara watched the play of firelight on his dark, bent head, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. There was a scar, a thin white line that disappeared into his hairline above his temple, a silent testament to some past violence. His presence was overwhelmingly physical, a stark contrast to the perfumed, mannered men of her former life. He bound her ankle with a practiced efficiency, the linen bandage firm but not too tight. "Keep off it as much as you can," he advised, his voice still gruff, but the edge softened by the act of care. "Should be better by morning, if it's just a sprain." "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He merely grunted in response, returning the salve and linen to the chest. The storm outside raged on, a wild symphony of wind and rain, effectively trapping them together in this small, isolated space. An uneasy truce settled between them, born of shared shelter and unspoken questions. Elara found herself observing him, the way he moved, the quiet intensity of his gaze, the deep lines of experience etched on his face. He was a man of the wilderness, self-contained, solitary. What brought him to such a remote existence? What ghosts haunted those watchful gray eyes? He, in turn, would occasionally glance at her, a quick, assessing look, before turning back to the fire or the storm-lashed window. She was an anomaly in his world, a fragile, out-of-place creature. He must be wondering about the fine quality of her torn skirt, the softness of her hands, now scraped and raw, the terror that still lingered in her eyes. The forced proximity was both a comfort and a source of tension, a fragile bubble of safety against the vast, dangerous world outside, yet filled with the electric awareness of two strangers thrown together by fate, each carrying their own secrets and burdens. The storm, as if exhausted by its own fury, began to subside as night deepened, the wind's howl softening to a mournful sigh, the rain easing to a gentle patter against the roof. Inside the small cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm, flickering light that painted the rough walls in hues of orange and red. The earlier tension had subtly shifted, replaced by a quiet weariness and the shared experience of weathering the tempest. Silas had offered Elara the single bunk, a gesture of unexpected chivalry, and had taken a spare blanket to make a bed for himself on the floor near the hearth. Elara, however, found sleep elusive. Her ankle throbbed with a dull ache, but it was her mind that raced, replaying the desperate flight, the looming threat of Bartholomew Thorne, and the uncertain future that stretched before her. She lay on the narrow bunk, staring up at the shadowy ceiling, the scent of wood smoke and the faint, lingering aroma of the salve Silas had used a strange counterpoint to her anxieties. She could hear Silas's steady breathing from across the room, a rhythmic sound that was, surprisingly, more comforting than alarming. He was a man of few words, his gruffness, a shield, yet his actions, the shelter, the coffee, the tending of her injury, spoke of a kindness he tried to conceal. Perhaps it was the lateness of the hour, the enforced intimacy of their shared refuge, or the sheer emotional exhaustion. But Elara felt a desperate need to unburden herself, to share the weight of her terror with someone, anyone, even this stoic stranger. "I didn't just get lost," she said softly into the dimness, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the small space. Silas stirred, propping himself up on an elbow, his silhouette dark against the dying firelight. He waited, his silence an invitation to continue. "I was running away," Elara confessed, the words tumbling out now, a torrent of fear and defiance. "From a marriage. A man I could not marry," she told him then, in hushed, urgent tones about Bartholomew Thorne, his cold possessiveness, the way he looked at her as if she were a trinket. She spoke of her family's ambition, their blindness to her misery, the suffocating weight of their expectations. She described the grand house that had become her prison, the beautiful gown that felt like a shroud. She didn't spare the details of her fear, her desperation, the feeling of being utterly trapped. As she spoke, she felt a small measure of relief, as if voicing the nightmare lessened its power. Silas listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on her, unreadable in the dim light. His stillness was profound, absorbing her words, her pain, without judgment. When she finally fell silent, the only sounds were the dripping rain outside and the soft hiss of the embers. "Thorne," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "I know the name. Big ranch, north of the Redwater. Powerful man. Not one to cross lightly." His words confirmed her fears, sending a fresh chill through her. If Silas knew of him even here, in this remote place, then Thorne's reach was indeed long. "He'll send men," Silas continued, his tone flat, stating a fact rather than a supposition. "He'll consider you his property." "I know," Elara whispered, her voice trembling, "but I won't go back. I can't." For a long moment Silas was silent again, contemplating the dying fire. Then he spoke, his voice softer than she had yet heard it, tinged with a weariness that seemed to echo her own. "Some folks spend their lives running," he said, more to himself than to her. "From others, from themselves. Sometimes there ain't no difference." He paused, and Elara sensed he was treading near the edge of his own closely guarded past. "Lost someone once," he said, his voice barely audible. "Someone I should have protected. Made a vow then to stand between trouble and those who can't stand for themselves when I can." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer details, but the brief, stark confession hung in the air, a glimpse into the pain that had shaped him, the reason for his solitude, for that haunted look in his eyes. It was a fragile offering, a piece of his own brokenness, shared in the darkness, and it forged an unexpected bond between them, two disparate souls seeking refuge not just from the storm, but from the harshness of the world. Elara felt a surge of empathy for this quiet, solitary man, a sense of connection that went beyond mere gratitude. He understood in his own way what it meant to be hunted, to be burdened by the past. "When morning comes," Silas said, breaking the quiet intimacy, his voice returning to his more practical tone, "and if that ankle of yours can bear it, I'll take you further south. There are small settlements, places you might disappear for a while, or get a stagecoach. Head further west." Elara's heart leaped. He was offering to help her, to actively aid her escape, not just provide temporary shelter. "You would do that?" she asked, a tremor of hope in her voice. "Why?" "Said I would," he replied gruffly, as if that were reason enough. "Get some sleep now. We'll need an early start." He lay back down, turning his face from the firelight, effectively ending the conversation. Elara lay back too, her mind still active, but a small measure of peace had settled within her. She was not alone. She had found an unlikely ally in this harsh, unforgiving land, a gruff cowboy with a hidden well of kindness and a past that resonated with her own desperate flight. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, but for the first time since she'd fled her father's house, a flicker of genuine hope ignited in Elara's heart, a tiny flame against the encroaching darkness. The dawn broke clear and cold, washing the landscape in pale, watery sunlight that did little to dispel the lingering chill of the storm. Elara's ankle, thanks to Silas's ministrations and the enforced rest, was tender but bearable. He had been right. It was likely just a sprain. Silas was already awake, the scent of fresh coffee and frying bacon filling the small cabin, a homely aroma that was a stark contrast to the tension that still hummed beneath the surface. He moved with his usual quiet efficiency, preparing a meager but fortifying breakfast of bacon, hardtack, and coffee. He had even found an old, patched, but clean pair of men's trousers and a sturdy shirt for Elara, recognizing that her torn riding skirt was impractical for hard travel. The clothes were too large, but they offered a freedom of movement her own attire had lacked, and a strange sense of anonymity, as if by shedding her feminine garments, she was also shedding a part of her vulnerable past. Silas had 2 horses, a raw-boned but sturdy gelding for himself, and a smaller, somewhat skittish mare. He helped Elara mount the mare, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist as he lifted her, yet there was a carefulness in his touch that she noted. "She's a bit green, but she's got spirit," he said, by way of introduction to the horse. "Keep a firm rein, but gentle. She'll test you." Elara, who had ridden since childhood, nodded, gathering the reins, feeling a surge of something akin to her old confidence. To be on horseback again, even under these dire circumstances, felt right. They set off at a steady pace, heading south, away from the direction of Thorne's ranch and her father's holdings. The land was vast, an endless tapestry of rolling hills, rocky outcrops, and wide, empty plains stretching towards a distant, hazy horizon. Silas rode with an easy, practiced grace, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, missing nothing. The flick of a deer's ear in the distance, the circling hawk high above, the subtle changes in the terrain. He was a man at home in this wilderness, a part of it. Elara, riding beside him, felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, despite the ever-present fear of pursuit. The rhythmic clip-clop of the hooves, the fresh, clean air, the sheer immensity of the landscape, it was all a balm to her frayed nerves. For long stretches, they rode in silence, a comfortable quiet that no longer felt oppressive. Occasionally, Silas would point out a landmark or name a plant, his words brief but informative. He taught her to read the subtle signs of the land, to look for water, to understand the language of the wild. She was a quick learner, eager to absorb his knowledge, recognizing it as a tool for survival. She learned to bank a fire so it left little trace, to move quietly, to be aware. The first few days were uneventful, a steady rhythm of riding, making camp in sheltered hollows, and pushing onward at first light. Elara grew stronger, more resilient, the hardships of the trail hardening her body and her spirit. The pampered young lady of drawing rooms was fading, replaced by a determined woman who could mend her own clothes, groom her horse, and endure the discomforts of the trail without complaint. Her fear of Silas had transformed into a deep, abiding respect, and something more, something she dared not name. She saw the kindness beneath his gruff exterior, the quiet integrity that guided his actions. He shared his meager rations without comment, always ensured she had the more sheltered spot to sleep, and treated her with a respect that Bartholomew Thorne, for all his wealth and supposed breeding, had never shown. Then, on the 4th day, as they were crossing a wide, open plain, Silas suddenly reined in his horse, his body tensing. "Riders," he said, his voice low and urgent, pointing to a distant cloud of dust on the horizon, far behind them. 3, maybe 4, coming fast. Elara's blood ran cold. Pursuers, Thorne's men. The brief illusion of safety shattered. "What do we do?" she whispered, her hand instinctively going to the small wooden bird in her pocket. "We ride," Silas said, his face grim. "There's a line of broken hills about 5 miles ahead. If we can reach them, we might lose them, or at least find a defensible position." He urged his horse into a gallop, and Elara followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The mare, true to Silas's word, had spirit, and she responded eagerly to Elara's urging, stretching out into a ground-eating pace. The chase was on. The wind whipped past Elara's face, carrying the drumming sound of their own hooves, and, fainter now, the sound of the pursuing horses. She risked a glance back. The dust cloud was closer, the figures of the riders more distinct. They were gaining. Fear, cold and sharp, spurred her on. Silas rolled like a demon, his body low over his horse's neck, guiding them expertly through the rough terrain. He glanced back at Elara, his expression unreadable but conveying a silent urgency. The broken hills seemed an eternity away. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she pushed the mare onward, matching Silas's desperate pace. This was no longer just an escape. It was a race for her life, for her freedom. And beside her rode a man who had, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, thrown his lot in with hers, a solitary cowboy standing between her and the darkness that threatened to engulf her. The bond between them, forged in shared hardship and unspoken understanding, deepened with every league they covered, every peril they faced together. The broken hills rose before them like a jagged wound in the earth, a chaotic jumble of rock, scrub, and narrow, winding canyons. Silas, with an instinct born of long familiarity with such terrain, led them into a tight, shadowed defile, the walls rising steeply on either side, effectively hiding them from the open plain. They dismounted, their horses lathered and blowing, their own breath coming in ragged gasps. The sounds of pursuit had faded, lost in the labyrinthine landscape, but both knew this was a temporary reprieve. Silas pressed his ear to the rock wall, listening intently. "They'll spread out," he said, his voice tight. "They know this country too, or Thorn wouldn't have hired them. We bought some time, that's all." He led the horses deeper into the canyon, their hooves muffled by the sandy bottom. Elara followed, her senses heightened, every nerve ending screaming with tension. The brief, wild gallop had drained her, but adrenaline still coursed through her veins. She looked at Silas, his face set in grim lines, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon rims above them. He was her protector, her guide. But the weight of that responsibility was evident in the taut set of his shoulders. They found a small, hidden alcove, little more than an overhang of rock, barely large enough to shelter them and the horses. From here, they had a narrow view of the canyon entrance, but were themselves well concealed. "We wait here," Silas said. "Let them pass. If they come this way, if not, we move again when it's dark." The waiting was a torment. The silence of the canyon, after the thunder of the chase, was unnerving. Every rustle of wind, every pebble dislodged by a scurrying lizard, sounded like the approach of their pursuers. Elara found herself clutching the wooden bird in her pocket, its smooth surface a small point of solace in the overwhelming anxiety. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of gold and crimson. Silas shared a little water and some dry jerky with her, their movements economical, their words few. The shared danger had stripped away any pretense, leaving a raw, unspoken connection between them. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows, Silas finally relaxed, just a fraction. "They've gone by or taken another route," he said, his voice low. "We'll rest here tonight. Move out before dawn." Relief, potent and immediate, washed over Elara, so intense it left her weak. They had evaded them, for now. That night, they built no fire. They ate a cold, meager meal in the deepening twilight. Elara, exhausted, leaned against the cool rock wall, watching Silas as he checked the horses, his movements sure and practiced even in the dim light. He seemed tireless, a man carved from the very rock that sheltered them. "Silas," she began, her voice hesitant. He turned, his face shadowed, patient. "Why are you doing all this for me? You could have turned me away at your cabin. You could have left me in the first town we passed." He was silent for a long moment, staring out at the sliver of star-dusted sky visible from their hiding place. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, "I know what it's like to have no one to turn to. Maybe I see something in you, something worth fighting for. Stubbornness, mostly," he added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, so fleeting she almost missed it. It was the closest he had come to admitting any personal feeling, and it warmed Elara more than any fire could have. A fragile sense of hope began to bloom again in her chest, a hope not just for her own safety, but for something more, something shared with this enigmatic man. The next few days saw them push further south into a different kind of country, more settled, though still wild. They passed small, isolated ranches, and once, a dusty, one-street town that seemed to cling precariously to the edge of nowhere. It was in this town, a place called Redemption Creek, a name that struck Elara with its poignant irony, that Silas suggested they might part ways. "There's a stage that comes through here twice a week," he said, his voice carefully neutral, as they stood by the town's ramshackle livery stable. "Heads west, towards the territories. or east if you've a mind to go back towards more civilized parts, though not your own, I reckon. The implication was clear. His job, as he saw it, was done. He had brought her to a place where she could lose herself, find passage to a new life. A wave of desolation, cold and sharp, washed over Elara. The thought of facing the world alone again, without Silas's quiet strength, his reassuring presence, was terrifying. She had grown to rely on him more than she had realized. "And you?" she asked, her voice small, trying to keep the tremor out of it. "What will you do?" He shrugged, looking out at the dusty street, his gaze distant. "Got a place I'll winter over sometimes, or maybe I'll just keep riding. Haven't decided." The casualness of his words belied the sudden tension that had sprung up between them. This was it then. The end of their journey together. She should be grateful, relieved to be free to make her own way, but all she felt was a profound sense of loss, a hollow ache in her chest. Did he feel nothing? Was she just another piece of trouble he had helped and would now forget? The stage wasn't due for another 2 days. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Would he stay until then? Or would he ride out in the morning, leaving her to face her future alone in this dusty, forgotten town? The subtle cliffhanger of his intentions, of her own unvoiced desires, tightened the knot of anxiety within her. She looked at his stoic profile, the lines of weariness and solitude etched on his face, and a wild, desperate thought took root. She didn't want him to go. The 2 days in Redemption Creek crawled by with an agonizing slowness, each hour thick with unspoken words and uncertain futures. Silas, true to some unvoiced commitment, did not ride out. He found them lodging in a relatively clean, if Spartan, room above the town's only mercantile, paying for it with coins that seemed to materialize from a well-worn leather pouch he kept hidden. He said little about his own plans, his silence a familiar cloak, yet Elara sensed a restlessness in him, a man accustomed to open spaces now confined by the dusty boardwalks and curious stares of the small town. They ate their meals in the dim, fly-specked eatery attached to the saloon. The food plain, the coffee weak, but it was a reprieve from trail rations. Elara found herself watching Silas constantly, trying to decipher the thoughts behind his stoic mask. Was he relieved to be shedding the burden of her company? Or did he, perhaps, feel a fraction of the reluctance that consumed her at the thought of their parting? She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Bartholomew Thorne would not give up easily. His pride, if not any genuine affection, would demand her return. Redemption Creek, for all its remote isolation, was not invisible. Word traveled, even in these sparse lands. The thought that her pursuers might still find her, even here, was a constant, gnawing fear. On the afternoon before the stage was due, as Elara sat by the grimy window of their room, mending a tear in the borrowed shirt Silas had given her, she saw them. 3 riders, entering town from the north, the direction from which she and Silas had fled. Her blood turned to ice. One man, taller than the others, with a certain arrogance set to his shoulders, rode slightly ahead. Even at this distance, with his face obscured by his hat and the dust of travel, she knew. Bartholomew Thorne. Her breath hitched in her throat. Panic, cold and overwhelming, threatened to paralyze her. They had found her. Silas was downstairs, ostensibly checking on the horses, but she knew he was also keeping a watchful eye on the town's comings and goings. She had to warn him. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely thread the needle. Scrambling to her feet, her mending forgotten, she hurried to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She nearly collided with Silas on the narrow landing. He took one look at her white face, her wide, terrified eyes, and knew. "They're here," she whispered, her voice choked. "Thorne, I saw him." Silas's face hardened, the lines around his mouth tightening. His gray eyes, usually so calm, glinted with a dangerous light. "How many?" he asked, his voice low and steady, a rock in the storm of her fear. 3. Him and 2 others. He nodded slowly, his mind clearly working. "Stay here," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." He turned to go, but Elara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his worn leather vest. "Silas, no. You can't face them alone." They're armed. He's ruthless. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Been facing ruthless men my whole life, Elara. It's what I do. He gently detached her hand. This ain't just your fight anymore. Before she could protest further, he was gone, his boots thudding purposefully down the wooden stairs. Elara locked the door, her body trembling, pressing her ear against the wood, straining to hear. The mercantile below was quiet, too quiet. Then she heard voices, muffled at first, then louder, angrier. Bartholomew's distinct, imperious tones, demanding, arrogant. And Silas's, lower, calmer, but with an unmistakable edge of steel. The confrontation had begun. Elara paced the small room like a caged animal. She couldn't just hide here while Silas faced danger on her behalf. The woman who had fled her father's house in terror was not the same woman who stood in this dusty room. She had faced hardship, found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Silas had shown her that, and now it was her turn to stand. Taking a deep breath, she unbolted the door and slipped out, her heart pounding, but a new, fierce resolve hardening her spirit. She crept to the top of the stairs, peering down into the mercantile. Bartholomew Thorne stood in the center of the store, flanked by two rough-looking men, their hands hovering near the guns holstered at their hips. Thorne himself, impeccably dressed despite the trail dust, held a riding crop, tapping it impatiently against his thigh. He was sneering at Silas, who stood calmly before him, his stance relaxed but ready, his hands loose at his sides. "My property, Cowboy," Thorne was saying, his voice dripping with disdain. "My betrothed, you will step aside, or you will be removed." Silas's voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "She ain't property, Thorne, and she ain't going anywhere with you." Thorne's face flushed an ugly red. "Insolent cur, do you know who I am? I know you're a man who frightens women and bullies those he thinks are weaker," Silas retorted, his gaze unwavering. "And I know you're not taking her." "Enough of this," Thorne snarled, raising his crop as if to strike. At that moment, Elara found her voice. "Bartholomew!" she cried, her voice ringing out clear and strong, startling them all. She descended the stairs, her head held high, her gaze fixed on the man who had sought to own her. "I am not your property. I will not marry you. I will never go back with you." Thorne stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief, then narrowing with fury. "Elara, what is the meaning of this? This vagrant has clearly filled your head with nonsense. You will come with me now." "No," she said, her voice firm, devoid of the fear that had once crippled her. She moved to stand beside Silas, a small, defiant figure against the backdrop of rough-hewn shelves. "I am not the frightened girl you thought you could control. My life is my own, and I choose freedom." The air crackled with tension. Thorne's men shifted uneasily. Bartholomew himself looked from Elara's resolute face to Silas's implacable one, his arrogance momentarily shaken by their united front. The fight was far from over, but Elara had spoken her truth, found her courage. She was no longer just fleeing, she was fighting back. Bartholomew Thorne's face contorted into a mask of rage, his carefully cultivated composure shattering like brittle glass. The sight of Elara, not cowering and subservient, but standing proud and defiant beside the stoic cowboy, was an affront to his monumental ego, a direct challenge to his authority. "Freedom?" He spat, his voice venomous. "You speak of freedom when you are clearly in the thrall of this ruffian. He has bewitched you, turned you against your own family, your own station." He took a menacing step forward, his riding crop now gripped like a weapon. "You will regret this insolence, Elara. Both of you will." One of Thorne's men, a hulking brute with a scarred face, made a move towards Silas, his hand dropping to his gun. Quicker than Elara could follow, Silas moved. He wasn't a gunman in the flashy, theatrical sense, but there was a deadly efficiency to his actions. He didn't draw his own weapon. Instead, he lunged forward, deflecting the brute's arm with a hard chop to the wrist, the sound of bone hitting bone sharp in the sudden silence. The man howled in pain, his gun clattering to the wooden floor, Silas followed through with a swift, brutal punch to the jaw that sent the man sprawling backwards into a display of tinned goods, shelves crashing down around him. The second henchman, momentarily stunned, fumbled for his pistol. Elara screamed, a pure, primal sound of terror for Silas, but Silas was already spinning, his movements fluid and economical. He kicked a nearby crate into the second man's shins, unbalancing him, and before the man could recover, Silas had disarmed him too, sending his gun skittering into a dark corner. It was over in seconds, a blur of contained, effective violence. Silas stood, breathing a little heavily but otherwise unharmed, between Elara and the now disarmed, groaning henchman. Bartholomew Thorne, however, was made of more persistent, if less physically capable, stuff. His face was pale with fury and a dawning, unwelcome realization that his usual tactics of intimidation and implied threat were useless here. "You will pay for this, cowboy!" Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking. "I have friends, influence. I will see you hanged." "Maybe," Silas said, his voice calm but cold as a mountain stream. "But not today, and not for protecting an innocent woman from a man like you." He took a step towards Thorne, and for the first time, Elara saw a flicker of genuine fear in Bartholomew's pale eyes. The man who thrived on control was losing it, rapidly. "As for you, Elara," Thorne said, turning his venom on her, his voice regaining some of its imperious bluster now that Silas was focused on him. "Your father will hear of this. Your name will be mud in every decent household from here to St. Louis. You will be an outcast, a pariah." Elara flinched at the mention of her father, the ingrained duty and fear still holding a sliver of power, but she straightened her shoulders, meeting his glare with a newfound resolve. "My father made his choice when he valued your wealth over my happiness," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "And I have made mine. I choose a life where I am seen, not owned. I choose to be more than a name in a society ledger. I choose to be me." Her words, simple but heartfelt, seemed to hang in the dusty air. The storekeeper, who had been cowering behind his counter, peeked out, his eyes wide. A few townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, had gathered silently at the doorway, watching the drama unfold. Thorne, realizing he had lost not only the physical confrontation, but also the moral high ground in the eyes of these strangers, seemed to deflagrate. His bluster collapsed, leaving behind a bitter, humiliated man. "You are a fool, Elara," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier passion, tasting the ashes of his defeat. "You will come to regret throwing away everything for this." He gestured vaguely at Silas, at the dusty town, at the uncertain future she had chosen. "No," Elara said softly, a quiet certainty in her voice. "I regret nothing that has brought me to this moment of true freedom." Silas stepped forward again, his presence a silent, unyielding barrier. "It's time for you to leave, Thorne," he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Your business in Redemption Creek is concluded." Thorne shot one last look of pure hatred at Silas and a look of bitter contempt at Elara. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the mercantile, his two chastened henchmen scrambling to follow him, one clutching his injured wrist, the other limping. They mounted their horses and rode out of town, not with the arrogant swagger of their arrival, but with the hunched shoulders of defeated men. A collective sigh seemed to go through the onlookers. The storekeeper finally emerged fully, looking from Elara to Silas with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Elara felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving her trembling and weak-kneed. But beneath the exhaustion was a profound sense of release, of liberation. The chains that had bound her for so long had finally been broken. She had faced her tormentor and, with Silas by her side, she had won. She turned to Silas, her eyes shining with unshed tears, 1,000 unspoken emotions welling up within her. Gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, more tender. "Silas," she whispered, her voice thick. He looked at her, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. A tiny muscle flickered in his jaw. "You were brave, Elara," he said, his voice gruff, but with an undercurrent of warmth that made her heart swell. You found your own voice. She had. And in doing so, she had found herself. The sorrow for her lost family, for the betrayal she had endured, was still there, a dull ache in her heart, but it was now overlaid with the fierce, bright joy of her newfound freedom, a freedom she had claimed not just by running, but by standing her ground. And she had not stood alone. The stagecoach, a lumbering, dust-caked behemoth, was scheduled to depart at noon. Elara stood with Silas by the livery, the sounds of Redemption Creek, a distant blacksmith's hammer, the murmur of voices from the saloon, the lazy buzz of flies, forming a backdrop to the quiet intensity of their farewell, or what was supposed to be their farewell. Bartholomew Thorne was gone, his threat neutralized, at least for now. Elara was free, truly free, to choose her own path. The ticket Silas had purchased for her, a small, precious square of paper, lay in her palm, a passport to an unknown future in the Western Territories. Yet, as the hour of departure drew near, a profound reluctance settled in her heart, heavier than any stone. She looked at Silas, this quiet, solitary man who had become her protector, her confidant, her unlikely anchor in a world turned upside down. His face was, as always, stoic, revealing little of his thoughts, but she fancied she saw a new softness in the lines around his gray eyes, a lingering watchfulness that spoke of more than just concern for her safety. "So," she said, her voice carefully light, though her heart felt anything but. "This is it, then. You ride north, and I ride west." Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the dusty street. "Reckon so," he said, his voice low. "You'll be safe now. Thorne won't bother you again, not after today. Word will get around. Safe. Yes, perhaps physically safe. But the thought of continuing her journey alone, without his steady presence, his quiet strength, filled her with an unexpected desolation. She thought of the long days on the trail, the shared hardships, the comfortable silences, the rare, fleeting smiles he had given her. She thought of the way he had stood before Thorne, an unbreachable wall of courage for her. I don't know how to thank you, Silas," she began, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "You saved my life. More than once. You gave me back my freedom." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something deep and vulnerable in their depths, something that mirrored the ache in her own chest. "You saved yourself, Elara," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. "I just cleared the path a bit." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package. "This ain't much," he said, pressing it into her hand. "But maybe it'll remind you that not all trails have to be walked alone." Alara's fingers fumbled with the twine. Inside, nestled on a piece of soft leather, was a small, intricately carved wooden flower, its petals delicate and lifelike, clearly the work of a patient, skilled hand. It was beautiful, a stark contrast to the harshness of his life, a testament to a hidden sensitivity. Tears welled in her eyes. "Silas, it's beautiful. Found I had a bit of time on my hands some winters," he mumbled, a faint flush rising on his weathered cheeks, making him look unexpectedly boyish. The stagecoach rumbled to a halt nearby, the driver shouting for passengers. The moment of decision was upon her. Elara looked at the ticket in her hand, then at the wooden flower, then back at Silas. A new, audacious thought, born of the courage she had discovered within herself, took root. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady, her gaze unwavering. What if my trail led north for a while? With you?" He stared at her, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly, surprise, and something else, hope, dawning on his face. "Elara, I ain't got much to offer. A rough life. No fancy house, no security like Thorne could give you." "I'm not looking for fancy houses or security, Silas," she interrupted gently, stepping closer, her hand resting on his arm. "I'm looking for honesty, for kindness, for a place where I can be myself. I think I found that with you. A slow smile, a genuine, unguarded smile, spread across Silas Blackwood's face, transforming his rugged features, chasing away the shadows from his eyes. It was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "Well, now," he said, his voice filled with a warmth that enveloped her, "the trail north can be mighty lonesome. Company would be welcome." He didn't say more, didn't need to. His eyes, alight with a tender, hopeful glow, said everything. Elara smiled back, a joyous, radiant smile that came from the very depths of her soul. She let the stagecoach ticket flutter from her fingers, a small, insignificant scrap of paper carried away by the dusty breeze. Her path was clear now. It led not west, into an unknown solitude, but north, with this quiet, courageous cowboy who had ridden into her life and claimed not just her gratitude, but her heart. They mounted their horses, Elara on her spirited mare, Silas on his sturdy gelding. Side by side, they rode out of Redemption Creek, leaving behind the ghosts of her past and the wreckage of Bartholomew Thorne's ambitions. The sun was warm on their faces, the vast open sky, a canopy of brilliant blue above them. The road ahead was uncertain, perhaps still fraught with hardship, but they would face it together. Elara Vance, who had fled a gilded cage in terror, now rode towards a new horizon, her heart filled with a quiet, profound peace and a soaring, inspirational hope. And Silas Blackwood, the solitary man who valued actions over words, rode beside her, his gruff exterior softened, his own lonely trail finally, blessedly, shared. There were two souls, once lost and adrift, now finding their way, together, towards a future they would build with their own hands, under the wide, forgiving sky. What if your greatest escape leads you not just to freedom, but to a love you never dared to imagine? Elara's journey began in fear, a desperate flight from a future she could not bear. But along the harsh and dusty trails, she discovered not only the vastness of the world, but the boundless strength within her own heart. And in Silas, she found more than a protector. She found a kindred spirit, a man whose quiet courage and hidden kindness mirrored her own resilience. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope can flicker like a tenacious flame, and that true connection can be found in the most unexpected of places, with the most unexpected of people. Have you ever faced a moment that demanded all your courage? Have you ever found an ally when you least expected it? The paths we walk are rarely straight, often filled with unforeseen challenges and surprising turns. But perhaps it is in these very detours that we find our truest selves, and the connections that give life its deepest meaning. What new horizons are you riding towards? What unexpected companionship might await you on your own journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage, escape, and the bold claiming of a heart resonated with you, please consider giving it a like, subscribing for more tales of resilience and redemption, and sharing it with others who might find inspiration in Elara and Silas's journey. Your engagement helps these stories reach further, perhaps to someone who needs to hear that even after the deepest despair, a new dawn and a new love is always possible.